I didn't have it plugged in, you asked.
Oh, it was my fault, huh?
Oh, that's the intro.
Welcome to 33 Tangents, a weekly podcast featuring a rotating panel of co-hosts that all work together in the same company but live in different areas of the world. The discussions cover a wide variety of topics from digital analytics to working remotely to current happenings in business and technology. Our regular day-to-day conversations often go off in various directions, and the goal of this podcast is to share our ideas and find new ways to engage with others.
Rocketeer.
This week has gotten away from me, and we've got some great episodes coming up, some good guests, but I really haven't had a chance to put thought together.
I have a potential topic.
Perfect. That's what I was going to say. Let's just get on and just talk through stuff today.
All right. So one of the things that I've been talking about on the social medias a lot in the past couple of weeks is making some conscious choices for planning out my day and how I want to work. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, and Jim, you and I think talked about it yesterday with the whole sharpening the saw analogy. And I think someone on Twitter had responded to something I'd posted with that quote, or I said I think there's a quote about this, and someone's like, I can't remember who said the quote, something about if I had so many hours, I'd spend the first so many sharpening the saw before I chop down the tree. So I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of how that impacts marketing technology teams within companies. And I started thinking back to my career and when I left consulting and went client side. It's the same type of thing that happened back then. I'm looking up the years. So that was a long time ago, 2007. I left Omniture in 2007 and joined Spark Networks as manager of web analytics. And I was a team of one. And I was responsible for vendor selection, vendor management, any kind of things that were escalated within analytics or testing. I was responsible for implementation strategy, design, actual implementation, analysis, optimization, responsible for the whole thing. For one, people can't be strong in all those things, and I'm definitely not. There are things in there I'm stronger than others. But two, you end up getting a lot of masters as well. So, I had marketing that wanted help analyzing the effectiveness of their campaigns. I had executives that were interested in understanding our user behavior. I had a product that wanted to run A/B testing. I had the engineering team that wanted to track down weird user sessions to figure out what was. There's just so much to do. And we're seeing that still today. I think, at least with the companies that I've been working with over the last 10 years or so, and I'm sure you guys have seen similar, these teams that we're working with are very, very thin, very light, and we're asking them to do a lot. And one of the challenges with that is you're put in a situation where you may fully accept that sharpening the saw is the best solution for now and for long term. But when you have so many people yelling at you for your time, you often just go into panic reactionary mode and just start trying to serve all the masters. And oftentimes we see that leads to decision making that's not very well thought out. It may put a band-aid on something that's bleeding right now, but it's not best for what's long term. And then we see companies talk about, why are we struggling with maturing as an organization? It's like, well, if you're constantly in panic mode, you don't have the time to stand back and put in the time to properly structure things so you can mature. So that was a lot and a mouthful. But it's been 13 years since I was in that situation client side, and it still seems to be fairly commonplace that we load up our MarTech teams with very few people, but ask them to do a tremendous amount. So I guess two ways we can take this conversation. What do you guys think is the overriding issue on why our spend on people, specifically in analytics and optimization, is so relatively low. So we can go down that path. We can also go down the path of what things can we do and what are we advising our clients on to help them get out of that scenario of constantly being in a state of panic and thinking more deliberately about how they're framing their day and making decisions that may not be what the business wants to hear. It's going to take 5 days instead of one, but ultimately we're putting the business in a position to mature and see greater gains over time.
Yeah, there's definitely several different ways we can look at this and tackle it, and I don't think it's necessarily one cause. I mean, as you were talking, and we've tackled this before, so I don't want to touch on it. I just want to quickly mention it. We've talked before about MarTech sales and how I think they oversimplify things and make it seem like the technology itself solves the problem, not technology as the saw, and you need someone who's constantly sharpening it and using it. So that's definitely one aspect of it. But then I also think you you have a lot of these teams, or at least maybe vendors that these teams engage with, that are very inexperienced. So Bryant and I were talking with a client just 2 hours ago, and the marketing technology is not in scope for our engagement. That being said, we are the one who stood up the tag management platform, and we're the ones helping them get up to speed on the tag management platform so that they can manage the marketing tags while we manage the analytics data collection. And of course, we get this urgent request like, we need this tag deployed. And Bryant asks, well, when's the campaign go live? Last week. They wanted to start running it last week. And we just got the code. And they're like, well, how do we, how do we set expectations? And one of our stakeholders was like, do I go in and say, well, we're still getting trained up, so it's going to be 2 weeks now, but then in the future, maybe this or that. And my recommendation was flat out 2 weeks. It's a minimum 2 weeks. And as we dug into that, we realized that regardless of their expertise in the tools, there were other things outside of their control. So, I mean, I'm getting way into the weeds way too fast, but I think there's inexperience there as far as what goes into the data collection, and that you can't allow it to be a rush. And you have to be very careful about opening the door for exceptions, because quickly the exception will become the rule. Um, it's really it's this lack of experience around what goes into the data collection. So people just have this expectation of, oh, just put this tag up on the site and poof, everything magically works.
Yeah. So let me touch on the first thing on the sales aspect,
Yep.
because I have a current story, and then I'd love for you and Bryant to go more into that issue, because it is a very real issue and we see it all the time. In fact, I've heard it a couple times over the last few weeks where I pushed back and said, okay, here's everything that's happening. Here's why this is complex. Here's how we're going to attack it. And here's the design that's going to be scalable for you in the future. And the feedback is, whoa, I didn't realize it. I thought it was way easier than that. Right. And it tends to be more the business stakeholders that take that perspective, and those that are requesting. It's like, well, it's just you put some code on the page. It's super easy. Right. So I'd love for you to go down that path. But let me touch on the sales aspect first, because I think not only the vendors, I think those in our space are also partly responsible. And I'm talking about service agencies are partially responsible for that. So I'm currently talking with a prospect. And in our last phone call, they mentioned, hey, we're talking with another agency, seeing if they're the right fit for us. They're recommending that we buy solution X, and that will solve our problem. And they said, what would you do? I said, I would never hire them. And they said, why? And I said, well, people solve issues. Tools can be used to make that more efficient and easier. But if someone's telling you all you have to do is spend money on a tool and that's going to fix your issue, run. Right? Because that's enhancing this problem that we're talking about, that the mindset is, well, you just put a tool in place. It doesn't matter what people or what your current culture is or how you're utilizing. None of that matters. You just put the tool in place and it works. So I think the vendor sales teams are absolutely to blame, because they oversell how easy it is. And that leads into what we're going to talk about next. But also, I think a lot of service agencies, especially those that are getting comped and getting kickbacks from vendors are hugely to blame as well, because they're first selling the product, and then when that doesn't work, and after they've collected their kickback, then they come in and like, well, we can help make that better with, you just need to buy more of our services. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it's a very relevant conversation that I'm having right now.
Yeah, technology doesn't fill the people gap, and oftentimes people just assume it will. But yeah, I mean, I've got a handful of thoughts that have come through with this. I mean, the initial statement of people being expected to do more with less time, like that goes beyond, I think, analytics. Um, name a team that you've worked with that you felt like had an appropriate amount of expectations for the amount of time or people or resources that they could to execute it, be it sales, technology, or otherwise. It just seems like more and more is being handed. But when it comes down to like our space, I think that the underlying reason in which people are being overwhelmed or asked to do more than they're capable, or that they have the resources to do so, is a lack of planning that goes into what it is that a particular stakeholder wants, as well as them clearly defining the goals or what the end really looks like. People are quick to make decisions about wanting a particular report or type of data, but they don't articulate why they want it, how they want it, and what it should look like. And so oftentimes those that are implementing or architecting a solution are trying to guess what they would want and how they want it. And then the first version comes out, a report comes out, and the CEO or the CMO says, no, that's not at all what I wanted, or now I need this data, or now I need that data. But they're not truly planning and thinking through, in most cases, what they really want the end product to look like. And I am saying product in that reporting and data is a product, and they don't think about the fact that that product needs to be defined and spec'd out, and they're the consumer of that product. So those are some of my initial thoughts. And then with respect to kind of that topic, and Jim and I, we can go down that a little bit further, but immediately a quote came to mind to me, kind of one of the snarky quotes that basically says, a failure to plan on your part doesn't constitute an emergency on mine. Like oftentimes we're in situations where we're trying to please people, and as good people, like, we'll just do it and we'll think, okay, this is an exception. One time I'm going to implement this for you, but next time, try and give me a couple of weeks notice. But all too often those exceptions become the norm, and then it compounds on itself.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem that's rampant in the analytics space, because there is a lot of really nice people pleasers that work in this space. And unfortunately, that exception becomes the rule, to your point. And every time we make that exception, it just reinforces it that this is how we're going to work. And it turns into toxic environment. We see employees unhappy and leave. We see lack of maturity growth within organizations. So as much as we want to be a people pleaser, we also need to realize that long-term people pleasing is much more valuable than just the short term. On your first point, I wonder how much of the lack of planning do you see being on both sides of the equation? And the reason I ask that, and I maybe have used this analogy in the past, is that oftentimes on the analytics side, we tend to jump into things without planning as well, because we kind of take this, oh, it's Christmas Day, I just want to rip into my presents. I'm not going to read the instructions on how to, build this new thing I got. I'm just going to start building. So whether it's an implementation request or a request for insight, oftentimes we don't plan. We don't take that 70 to 80% time to plan and prepare. We just jump in and start pulling data, start, spouting off insights, just throw code into our tag manager and collect data. And it often backfires on us because we didn't do that planning. So how much of that lack of planning do you think is evident on both sides?
I think it depends. In every situation, there's there's a spectrum of like what requirements are given versus what questions should be asked to refine it. But I think I think the onus should be on us as implementers and technologists and solution builders, to ask those questions and actually push back on that. And if a client of ours comes to us and says, "Hey, we need this data," our first question should be why. The second question should be, how frequently are you going to use it? And the third question should be, what impact or changes are you going to make, or what decisions will you make that will change your customer's experience based on that data? And if they can't answer those three things, or don't have a very good answer for them, we need to question whether or not it's worth our time to solution it or spin up resources to deploy something. And so, in my early stages of consulting, that was actually more important as an interview question that I would ask prospects that wanted to join a firm with me to work with me, than their knowledge of at the time Omniture analytics, or whether it's Google AdWords, or name 1,000 other email vendors. Like my criteria for a good consultant or a good analyst is their ability to ask the right questions and push back at the right time than the technology used, because technology is going to change and those solutions are going to change. And the more a person knows about a specific technology, I think, is investing their time in the wrong type of training.
Do you think that that's something that just comes with time, or do you think that is something that we should be more focused on providing mentoring to ensure that the people that we're putting into these positions realize that there are more valuable skill sets than just knowing how to set a value in your MarTech solution of choice, or deploy a tag, or pull a report? Is that something you just have to learn, or is that something you think through mentoring that we can be doing a better job of teaching?
I think most things can be learned and taught, but I think in this particular case, we need to be better at forcing that mentorship out there, or encouraging that. I guess we can't force anything out there, but encouraging that mentorship of thinking, and actually being more of a thinker than just a doer. Your question actually made me think of something else too. I think in the industry, you said we're a lot of, we are good people. We are people pleasers. And I think we actually do that as much to satisfy our own curiosity at times of whether or not we can do something, because we want to be able to figure out a really complex problem. And so our own intrinsic curiosities can take over, and we'll say, well, that's really interesting. I wonder if we could do that. And it becomes kind of a little hunt for us to find the solution, as opposed to actually thinking, should we be doing it? But yeah, so I think that's a part of it. I think the more we can mentor and encourage those that are coming into this space, and even those that have been in this space, to think more and encourage that, that effective pushback, or that effective, like, just discover what the actual need is before you start doing, can go a long way. And one other thought that I just had too, and I'll yield for a minute here, but when one time, a long time ago in a previous life, I was studying to become an electrical engineer at the University of Utah, which I'm wearing their hat right now. And in one of my first programming classes I ever took, the instructor talked about what an algorithm is and how important an algorithm is in order to become a good programmer. And at the time, the algorithm was talking about all of the logic, or the words that described what your program was going to do. There was zero syntax, there was zero code involved in writing the algorithm. If we wanted to write a loop that would count, from 1 to 20, we'd have to write on words what that was supposed to be first before we wrote any syntax. And what the instructor talked about, and this was, again, a beginning programmer class, programming language in C, of all of the languages out there that are never used. But they talked about the more time you spend on your algorithm will dramatically decrease the amount of time you have in actually writing the code and debugging your own code. And it's something that I think we do in analytics. A major disservice is not thinking through that algorithm. What is the business justification? What's the reasoning? What do we want the report to actually look like, and how does it manifest it? And the technology is so capable now today that we can hack our way around a crappy implementation to get a report to somewhat manifest what we think it should, that oftentimes we don't build a robust solution, or a solution that's simple, that can actually just build that report easier. So I'll yield for a minute here.
You know what? Yeah, and it really makes me think about the content that we produce, and I'm wondering if it's because it's easier to produce a certain type of content, or maybe we don't think about the importance of having that discussion around thinking about how you design for analytics. And if you and to be fair, I don't think this is just in our space. I also see something really similar in kind of taking a step outward. So looking at the Python space and doing data analysis in Python, I run into the same type of problems where the thought leaders and those that are producing a lot of content have a lot of great articles on the code layer. Like set this line of code, run this report, do that. And I'm like, that's awesome. That helps me kind of get to where I want to be. But there's nowhere in there that says, and here was the thought process that I went through to get to the point to say, this is the line of code I wanted to use. And so I'm wondering, why that is. And let's just look at our space, and you look at the people that tend to have the biggest voice in our space. That's the content. And I think for us as well, if you look at our blog, that's a lot of our content is, here's the code. And that's great. And it solves a specific need, but it doesn't help mature the thinking process when we don't share, but here was the thought process and the process that I went through to get to the point to know that that's the line of code that I wanted to use.
Right.
Thoughts, Jim?
Yeah, if I could get off mute. I mean, there's several things, and it's not necessarily an answer. It's a follow-on observation to what you were talking about. It feels as if the thought, and this, you mentioned it several times before, the thud factor of a solution, right? How big or how detailed or how fancy the documentation is. It's like the thought process isn't valued, right? I just need these technical requirements. I just need this scope. I just need this report design, and so when you try to say, well, it's going to take 2 weeks to get to that point, it's like, well, can't you just turn it around? And maybe is it because the thought process is invisible? I don't know, but that's the first thing that came to my mind as you were talking about that.
So let's pivot this a little bit and maybe dive into one of the items you guys were talking about earlier, and that's the this is easy component. And I don't think we have much, if any, sway over the vendor sales teams that are going to continue to use that pitch. But what can we do as consultants? What can we do as managers of analytics? Regardless of our role, what can we do to help better educate the business on what it actually takes? Because I think it's important, because setting the proper expectations is going to ensure better communication and better results. But I also think it's important that we help educate so that they can set better expectations with their stakeholders. Oftentimes, they're just trying to turn things around, and they're just saying, well, based on what I think, it's going to be a day. So, what can we do to help better change that belief that, oh, this is just easy?
My immediate thought goes to one part of that is documenting what the overall tech stack looks like at a company. When a vendor comes to a sales presentation and they say, hey, yeah, it takes 30 minutes to deploy the base code and you can just customize anything there. What they're not taking into account is the fact that the CMS that the client is using is 15 years old and somebody built it from the ground up. And there's 30 other pieces of technology that are grown off of that and built custom off of it. And it looks like a giant piece of Frankenstein type of a solution. And all of a sudden, that really simple thing that you can just drop into a piece of code requires 14 individuals to look at before it can be deployed, and then another 12 to validate in a QA environment. Not to mention the unlimited permeations of exceptions that can break that now because of all of these other pieces. So how do we stop that, or how do we make people realize it's more complicated than simply, hey, drop this code in place and launch will do everything for you, or Google Tag Manager will do that for you? Is, I think, visually showcasing to people how many different pieces of technology are in place for a particular environment, and indicate that every one of the small or fragile links in that chain can cause massive disruption for any of the technology involved. One exception or one error thrown, early on in the foundational pieces of that technology, which oftentimes our technology in this space is built as backdoors into it, truthfully, right? Like launch and these tag manager tools are built to be backdoors to subvert all of those other processes in IT. Oftentimes we can be compounding an existing problem of an underlying framework that is just not stable, or has some instability that we're not aware of. So
Yeah.
documenting it and visualizing it, I think, is one way that we can start.
I agreed. And I think it's, as part of that process, it's really important to think really critically about the language that we used in doing that. It's something that I've been focused on more and more, as I'm kind of the bridge between the MarTech teams and upper executives, is that I'm trying to be more cautious of the words I'm using as I'm explaining why things are challenging and harder than they had expected. And I'm not saying to talk down to them or treat them like they're a child, but oftentimes our default is just to start to rattle off a lot of techno speak. And I think about Homer Simpson, where Marge starts talking to him about something, and then he's got the picture of the monkey in his head banging the cymbals together. You know what I'm talking about? I think that's what happens when we talk with stakeholders and we say things like, well, this is really hard because I have to set this EVAR on this landing page, and we've got our Adobe Analytics deployment happening through Telium, but there's a race condition when we're trying to attach to the data layer, which like the monkey like pops in the head and starts banging the cymbals. So I think we have to be a lot smarter about the language we're using to make sure that we're painting a realistic picture. Again, not dumbing it down and not talking to them as if they were a child, but not taking this like techno speak to them as some kind of a foreign language, because they're checking out of that conversation. So I think the emphasis needs to be on us to figure out how to better communicate some of those things and help them understand why it's a challenge, because clearly that approach isn't working. We can talk all day long about how setting these variables or doing this and that is hard, but unless they get it, it's not going to change their behavior.
Yeah, I find a lot of the conversations I have are really me being an interpreter between two different entities at a company, be it the technologists and those that are going to be using the output from the technology. And I feel like I've done fairly well in being able to translate that in a way that doesn't make people feel stupid, or like I'm talking down to them, but also B, I'm articulating the needs and simply, being there as an outside source. I mean, Jim, you and I have seen this too directly.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another account that I'm thinking of that we work on where Jen and I show up, and just by us initiating a meeting and then actually physically and verbally stepping back and watching two departments talk that have never talked before, and maybe moderating that, oftentimes unlocks a lot of the confusion that's existed between those areas.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think that there are two major values that come out of being able to do that. Number one is the obvious, is that if we can help create better communication, it ultimately gets us to a place that we want to be, where we're properly setting expectations, we're having things that are coming into us better informed, we're not in this emergency mode all the time. But I also think it potentially addresses something that has long been a challenge for this this role within organizations, is that oftentimes, and I'm a big fan of the IT Crowd. I don't know if you guys have ever watched it. British comedy, 4 seasons. It's amazing. But it's a really perfect visual for where analytics often sits within an organization. So the IT team is literally in the basement of the office tower, and the office tower is this beautiful tower with these great views of London. And then the IT department is literally in the basement. There's trash, there's garbage all over the hallways. Like, it's dark, it's dingy. That's where we often find ourselves as digital analytics practitioners, is that we're in the basement. We're constantly wanting to be in the upper floors with the executives. But if we're not able to elevate our conversation, then we're never going to get there. So I think if we can use this in the short term to fix a lot of the challenges we have, where unrealistic expectations are being set on us because there's a lack of understanding, a longer term byproduct is, I think, that if we start to elevate the language that we're using, it gives us a very real chance of getting out of the basement. And I think that obviously benefits us, but it greatly benefits the business to have us more closely aligned with the executive team.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another thing that would help as far as giving kind of advice for listeners that are out there right now is also stop assuming that you're smarter than everybody else out there, or assuming that people are inherently dumb or stupid in their particular role. I think we often use our own knowledge as a way to make ourselves feel better about what we're doing, and we think, oh man, Jim implemented this 5 years ago. What the hell was he thinking? Like, this is such a stupid solution. Like, no, I mean, like, that might be true, but let's assume that he knew what he was doing, and maybe look through that as well when we're we're trying to explain that. It's just such an easy thing, especially as an outside consultant, to come in and throw everybody previous to us under the bus as inadequate in what they were doing in trying to solve a business problem. So just assume people know what they're doing and work with them on that.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point, and we've discussed it before, is just, one of the overarching issues with the industry and why we keep going in cycles is people come in, and because maybe something doesn't match exactly the way they would do it, they feel it needs to be torn to the ground and rebuilt. And of course, it's oversimplified, oversold. And then, because I've seen it time and time again, someone new comes in, they see something, they're like, oh, no, it can't be done that way. We need to tear it down, but only to come find out that there are intricacies within the other tools, like you had mentioned, a 15-year-old, CMS, some other homegrown solution, that what they just tore down was built to handle some of the nuances of those other tools.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can have a whole episode on that, but you're right, and I think that's another huge reason why we are in the basement, is that that's where the foundation is. And if we're constantly tearing down the foundation and focusing our time on building it, we can't crawl out of that. And we see that a lot. We see that a lot where there's a lot of turnover in digital analytics. People come in and they rip down everything that was built before. And if you subscribe to the shoulders of giants, we're never going to stand on anyone's shoulders, because we're ripping everything down when we're staying in the basement, and then we turn around and we complain about it. So at some point in time, there needs to be some kind of balance there where we can start building upwards.
Yeah. Ironically, these companies that have all of this really, really crappy implementation and poor technology are making hundreds of millions of dollars with all of that tracking and crappy technology. I mean, it's just so funny to me that there is such a level of elitism and arrogance with some people, that they can walk into a company that is been around for 100 years in some cases, are making money hand over fist, and they can have the arrogance to walk in and say, your technology is all shit. Like, you need to tear it all down, and you need to do it this way because that's the right way. And it's like, well, can't you figure out like what we're actually doing here first? Because even though Jim built this 15 years ago, guess what? Like, it's serving all of our customers right now. It might not be doing it perfectly, but maybe we can take a little bit of a different approach. And obviously, I'm talking in extremes here, but I've seen that. And if there's one way to quickly get yourself, a lack of respect or not build bridges, it's to immediately start tearing down or criticizing other people's technology and businesses that way. And people do it just unintentionally, not realizing what they're doing to themselves and the image that they are portraying about themselves.
Well, no, I actually I want to double click into that for a moment. You mentioned that
Jim has started using like these corporate buzzwords in calls with me, and like he does a deadpan.
Like, ever since we did that podcast, like, maybe that was a bad idea because I basically increased Jim's vocabulary.
I think it was a bad idea, and what I was saying was I'll be on calls with Jim, and he did this yesterday, and he like is dropping these like corporate buzzwords, deadpan, doesn't even flinch, and just keeps going, and I stopped listening to what he's saying, and I'm thinking like, are you messing with me, man? Like, are you messing with me right now? Seriously.
Yeah.
And he just keeps going. So I don't know if like you just seeded these things in his head and he's just saying them now, or if he's seriously just messing with me. Like, I'm going to drop something in here.
I think
are you serious?
Yeah. You said yesterday we were on a call and you're like, we don't want to boil the ocean here. I'm like, is he messing with me right now?
Oh shit. Maybe I'm worse than I thought I was.
He didn't even drop. Maybe he's not messing with me. You just like put all these words in his head, dude, and now it's just
now you've made me even more self-conscious.
I put all of the best words in his head, like the bestest of the vocabularies,
Like, well, going back to what I was saying, and I'm trying to remember my train of thought. The whole double click thing was an intentional joke.
Yeah.
But like you, God, what did you say?
I was talking about people that go in and rip apart technology. Yeah.
Oh, so you had said that, and you had said something earlier too that made me think like, part of it is intentional, but then I think part of the problem is when people do that because it starts this vicious cycle of overselling. Or Jason, to your point of like, you were talking with a prospect and, they have another they're working with somebody else on scope, and they came in, they said they could solve the problem right away. That's also part of the problem is these people that come in and say right off the bat, I can solve the problem with very little discovery or analysis. So that sets the table right there that very little information should be needed to solve the problem. So when we come in and say, whoa, I need more details, people are like, well, what do you mean? Why can't you do what you need to do based on what I told you? What more information do you need? I mean, I've encountered that, and you made me think of that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and we need to be emphasizing the value of sustainability over the value of short-term gratification. I think it comes down to that a lot, is that we want everything and we want it right now. And if we don't get it, then we're unhappy, even though the right now may be the worst thing possible from a do it. We really need to get our video feed going. Our listeners are missing out on a lot of great visuals here. So
that's on my desk. Like, it's on my desk.
Yeah, so I think we need to be doing a better job of emphasizing the value of sustainability over short-term gratification. I think it solves a lot of problems. And by the way, noting visuals, your backdrop is so zen and calming with your saltwater reef. It's very nice.
Yeah. So for those that can't see, I held up a mug of one of my favorite TV shows, Rick and Morty, and Rick is stating, "No, you're right. Let's do it the dumbest way possible because it's easier for you." And that's a mug that I have on my desk to remind me of things like this. And and I do have a 70-gallon saltwater reef tank in my
It's
backdrop
beautiful. It's
that,
beautiful.
that Jason's looking at. So
Yeah. So we need to be doing a better job of helping people understand that there is value to be gained with thinking about sustainability.
yeah,
Because again, I think it's too easy to sell the here and now. We see it a lot. I see it a lot on the sales side because I'm up against competition that is telling companies what they want to hear, and oftentimes I'm shocking prospects when I'm saying it's the wrong way to think about it. I'm not going to do that for you. I'm going to give you a proposal for what's best for you long term. We've lost deals because of that, where they say, "Oh no, we just need this fix right now." I'm like, well, but
so
you,
you made me actually think of a deal that we'd worked with someone for a few months, and then we came back to them and said, hey, we want to keep working together. Here's what it's going to take is a lot of thinking and a lot of ways that we want to work with you. They ultimately decided to go another direction. My question to you, Jason, is in the course of running 33 sticks, do you have times in which we have pushed on clients to do something that's uncomfortable, and regardless of cost, like, because I think cost is an easy way that people can throw things around and make excuses, but push somebody to do something uncomfortable because it was right and they didn't do it, but have come back to you later and stated, I wish we had done this with you.
yeah,
You have,
that
you
it's
have
happened.
examples of that?
Yeah, it's happened multiple times, both with clients where we've been able to re-engage with them, and others where people have left the organization and come back to me and
Mm-hmm.
said,
Yeah.
man, I screwed up that decision. I really wish I would have done that differently. And that's what, I think it was is good for us to kind of go those separate directions. And sometimes it's from the prospect or client, and sometimes it's from us saying, if you can't get on board with it, we're not going to be able to work together, because ultimately in the long run, smart people will see the value in that. And the fact that people are able to learn a valuable lesson from that, I think, is way more important than the value of maybe a short-term deal where we didn't, we just jumped in and did it. So it's hard though. It is hard because we want to please now, we want the now. But over 7 years of building this company, I have learned that making decisions that have the future in mind have never come back to hurt me.
Yeah.
And sure, it may have made things more difficult in the short term, this week or this quarter, but in the long term, the gains and the value of making those decisions far outweighed it. So if you're able to stave off the short term pain, you will absolutely benefit in the long run.
Yeah, and I think as part of that, you were talking about like elevating the conversation, elevating the words used, and not getting too much into the techno babble to educate a client on what's involved. I think part of that too, and this is something I've been trying to practice, is standing firm, not getting caught up in the emergency, and creating exceptions. Because as we had mentioned very early in the conversation, the exception quickly becomes the rule. The okay, I'll make an exception this time. Well, that sets the expectation that you're always going to be able to do it, or always be able to turn around something quickly. It's standing firm on what the expectation should be.
Yeah, and I think that can be a really, really valuable conversation. We maybe make a note of having a future episode where we bring Evan back on to talk about that, because I think I agree with
Mm-hmm.
you, but that also takes a tremendous amount of trust. And so I think there's a real organizational component from a cultural standpoint and from a management skills standpoint to make that work. Because if I'm, let's say, a manager of analytics, and I know that this is the right approach, but I don't have trust in my management chain, then I'm making decisions not based on what's best for the organization, but what's going to keep me sustained in a
Mm-hmm.
job so I can pay my bills. From a consulting perspective, it's no different. If you guys didn't have my trust, it's really difficult for you to stand firm with the client, because if the client gets upset or we lose the client, now I'm like, well, Jim's fired, right? So you have to have that trust that you're doing the right thing, that you're you're making choices that we believe is best and aligned with our culture, right? And we kind of joke about it, but I'm serious. I don't think that there are other consultants and other agencies that have that same level of trust that you have. So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's much more difficult. And there are consultants that have really strong kind of backbone and able to do that regardless, but most aren't. And if they're not in a situation where they feel safe and trusted, they're going to lead clients down a wrong path because they're making decisions for their self-preservation.
Mm-hmm. Several years ago, I worked in an organization, and on the agency side of things, it was who screamed the loudest. So whomever yelled and threatened the most, they got what they wanted. So, Jason, what you were saying there is very, very true. People were in fear of, some level of punishment coming back their way. There was, a level of fear of retribution, screaming to your boss and your boss's boss to get stuff done. And the level of trust we've been able to build up, I mean, that wasn't there immediately, but it's something we had to work on, or that, that trust was there, that we were both out for the same thing and the right thing.
We have, if you didn't have a list of topics for future episodes, I think we have 3 or 4 coming out of this that are absolutely really, really valuable topics we should follow up on. From this conversation, I think we've hit on a few key things. Brian brought up the importance of being able to communicate across organizations, and really the big takeaway from that is being really careful with the language we use so that we're effectively communicating and kind of elevating that conversation. We've talked a lot in the end about trust and kind of doing the right thing. And man, if you're not in a situation where you're trusted and you feel safe, you probably should move out of that. But ultimately, in your role as an analytics practitioner, for me, I've harped on this a lot. I did a session a couple years ago at one of Observe Point summits on sustainability. For me, we need to be thinking much more about sustainability and stop making rash short-term decisions that may feel good right now. But ultimately, these things start to pile up and become a huge weight on us. And in the end, we end up quitting jobs, leaving, people aren't happy. That adds to the turnover problem. So thinking sustainably is something that I think we need to do a better job from an industry perspective in pushing and helping people feel safe in making those smart long-term decisions.
Well, and take that beyond just this job or this task at hand. Like, I think that's just it's a good way to live and have your day to day is, we recently moved, and I've got a massive list of home projects to work on now. And one of the things I'm really trying to be deliberate about as I work on projects here at home, which may not be directly related to analytics, but it's just don't do anything quick and cheap. Don't do anything, just to stop something immediately, but think through what is the best solution for a particular problem and take the time to do something right. Otherwise, I
Yeah.
will be, like when it comes to a home or home repairs, if you do something crappy just because it takes you 5 minutes versus 50 the first time, you're going to spend much more than that 50 over the next few years coming back to that same particular
Yeah.
problem. So
No,
just do something right the first time and think it
yeah.
through.
I was exactly going to say that. Like, how many times have we made a purchase where we see an item, it's like, oh, we really want that, but the price tag seems high, so you go for the cheaper version, and then you're kicking yourself because you spend 3 times the amount, either because the thing broke and you have to replace it, or the cheaper version just doesn't work the way you want it, so you need to buy the full version or the more expensive
Yeah.
version. It happens all the time.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I love that you're taking that approach, Brian. I've actually been thinking about writing an article because I've been talking a bit about some of the changes I've made this year to be more structured in how I think and work. And that is something that I'm absolutely committed to this year, is finding the joy in enjoying the process. And I think this goes to, being able to delay gratification, is that we think that the joy is at the end when we get to it. So we take shortcuts so we can get to the end. And to counter that, I've been really finding it just really amazing, and finding the joy and just enjoying the process of getting there. And it's life-changing.
It's such the old cliche that life's a journey, not a destination, right? But it
Yep.
like maybe those grandparents of ours knew what they were talking about, you know.
Agreed. Are you
I'm just smirking. What are you looking at?
Bryant's smirking. All right. This is awesome conversation.
It really was. So
One
yeah,
more
great
topic
Jason.
for future discussion is when to fire a client, when it's okay to say goodbye. I think that would be a good topic.
Yeah, that's a powerful one.
Yep. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, glad
we decided to lift your suspension.
Yeah.
He's back in the first team.
Yeah, just double click into it.
We have a lot of emotions to boil, so we need all the hands we can get to be focused on this key initiative.
Sweet.
Yep. All right, guys.
I'm done with the both of you.
See ya.
No, great conversation, great topic, Jason. Bryant, great talking to you. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up for now. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of 33 Tangents. If you enjoyed what you heard, please rate and review the show on your favorite podcast aggregator so others can find us. If you would like to reach us, you can do so by emailing podcast@33sticks.com or on the web at 33tangents.33sticks.com. 33 Tangents is a production of 33 Sticks, an analytics boutique.